So, okay, so you were at the what's it called 409 Squadron? You said,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
409 Squadron. What, 2 years you were there?
58 to 60. You bet.
Okay, and then after that, you moved on to you called it CP, I think. I'm not sure what that is.
Well, I figured you wouldn't know, but what the hell? I wasn't going to spell it.
No, that's fine. You can spell it for all of us now.
Well, I left 409 and went back to school for a year at the U of T for some postgraduate work, and then they posted me from there to the Central Experimental Improving Establishment
Okay,
at Uplands.
so you're test pilot.
Well, that was their business.
Okay.
They took new airplanes and made them suitable for operations, and this would include weapons and any number of things, ejection seats, anything at all. If you wanted to modify the airplane, and everybody does, you had to get a blessing from CP.
Okay.
And so we had a wonderful collection of airplanes, F-86, CF-100, a couple of DC-3s, a couple of Expeditors, 104s in Cold Lake, P2V7 was assigned, Harvard. It's just a real
Mix mash almost.
Oh, and it was so much. There were months I would fly 50, 60 hours. I had 10 or 12 types.
Wow.
I was legal on everything,
Wow.
and I flew everything, and I loved it. It was,
Oh, yeah.
and I was comfortable in everything. After a while, there's a certain similarity, and so when they shipped me off to the Empire Test Pilot School, which cost them, as I recall, $300,000.
Back in the 60s, that's a lot of money. Now, the Empire Test School, that's in Britain.
That's in England,
Yeah,
at
okay.
Farnborough.
Okay. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so anyway, I go over to England, and my wife was teaching at the time, so she came over when she'd finished her contract teaching. And there was a classic case of a guy that was a big fish in a small pond.
Mm-hmm.
And I got over to England, and I feeling quite pleased with myself
Okay.
and extremely confident. And it was there I discovered I was nothing special. It was there I discovered that I was a small fish in a big pond with a lot bigger fishes. And it was a wake-up call for me, which I never forgot, by the way. And the overconfidence and the foolishness was drummed out of me.
Or beaten
Not
out
by
of you.
the, well, it was by example.
Okay, well, that's good, though.
There were guys, one of the tutors there was sporting an Air Force cross because he'd been flying U-2s over Russia, which then the U-2 was a handful, and we had tutors, they all had, as I recall, they all had DFCs from World War II.
Oh.
And smart and just everything.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story about Empire Test Pilot School. I hadn't been there very long. And they had a lot, Hunter, oh God, they had everything. Vampire, Meteor, Hunter, Scimitar. Scimitar's a naval airplane.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pound of thrust for a pound of weight, very fast. Viscount, Doves, Provo, Chipmunk. So I'm up one day in the Chipmunk and doing spins, and it caught fire.
Oh.
And I can see the airport's not too far away, and so I shut off the engine, and the fire sort of went out, but it kept smoking. It turned out there was a fuel line or something that had been leaking a bit,
Okay.
and it had fired up and started other things burning. And it seemed like a really good idea to turn off the engine, so I did that. So then I called up Farnborough and said, in the finest Captain Cool And it's a chipmunk, let's face it. You can't get hurt in a chipmunk. And called up and said,
You can fly into a wall, it'll bounce off the wall.
tester, whatever I was, I'm on fire. I was gone out. I've been on fire. My engine's off. I want a dead stick landing back at the airport. I can make it. And the tower responded by getting everybody out of my way, which seemed reasonable because I wasn't very far away. So I came in and it's embarrassing. I successfully dead sticked the chipmunk on the runway, which was no big feat, and wandered back into the flights. And there was my tutor. In the meantime, they're hauling my chipmunk, which is still smoking, in because some other things had kind of been scorched and things. So my tutor was a fine guy named Eddie Rigg, who had had a lifetime of test piloting for the RAF. So he comes up to me, and I'm sitting slouched in a chair, nice big, soft, easy chair, and he comes up to me and he says, quote, "Bentham, Bentham, Bentham, what is all the fuss about?" And I replied, "There was no fuss. I was on fire." He says, and he walks out to look at the airplane. And he comes back in 5 minutes later, and he walks up to me and he says, "Well, Bentham, it wasn't a very big fire." And I'd been there about a month.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the RCAF, whatever you were flying, if it was on fire and you had to dead stick the airplane, sooner or later somebody would come in and say, "Attaboy."
Yeah.
Short, not quite an Air Force cross, but an indication of approval.
Yeah.
Whereas Rigg, the tutor, was going to take the mickey out of me, and rightly so, because he was my tutor. He had already detected that I was
A little cocky.
a little cocky,
Yeah.
and pleased with myself, even though I was learning fast.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I always remembered that it wasn't a very big fire. Well, I'm sorry it wasn't a big fire.
I'll try harder to impress you next time.
Well, if I left the engine running for a while, I would have had a big fire,
Absolutely.
and then you would have been happy. But no, I didn't. I kept my mouth shut, as I found that was often the best thing to do.
Probably,
Yeah. So anyway,
So you went to Farnborough. How long were you there for?
a year,
A year. How old were you at the time?
29.
29. Okay.
Yeah.
So you were getting to be a more seasoned.
I was, but I was also seeing that I wasn't so keen about coming back to the Air Force and moving every year or two and try to, it's hard on your wife.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you're going to have kids, which I hadn't had until then, thank God,
Mm-hmm.
the contraception worked. But that was going to change.
Yeah.
And so even though I enjoyed Farnborough immensely, I'd already, in the darkest corner of my mind, thought, I'm getting too old for this.
Okay. Well, fair
I
enough.
mean, too old for the military
Yeah.
lifestyle. And I don't know how long you were in the Army, maybe a lot longer than me.
No, just 6 years. I was a reservist too, so I never really left my hometown.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit different for me,
that
but
was
I
to
understand
come
it.
later.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at Farnborough, another interesting day, they walked in one early on in the course, and they said, "Who wants to make a parachute jump?" And I was surprised, with only about half of us put our hands up. The half that didn't were Brits. You learn in the military, don't volunteer. But I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So I put my hand up. About half, maybe more than half, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of the class put their hands up. And promptly forgot about it. Nothing happened for about 3 or 4 months. And then one day they came in and said, "Tomorrow you've got to make your parachute jump." Oh, that's interesting. This afternoon you're going to pick up a parachute at Aldershot. So went over there. and there's this grizzled old Brit Army sergeant in charge of parachutes, and so he issued us each a harness, explained to us what we needed to do in words, told us that when you feel you're getting close to the water, point your toes, disarm, unlock the quick release, and then as your toes touch the water, hit the quick release, the parachute will fall away, and you will swim away like a dolphin.
That was your training.
That was it. And the next day, we go to the field, and there's a short Belfast, a most god-awful 4-engined British version of the Hercules, which I flew later, which was unbelievably crude and primitive. And so it had a hatch in the back on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And the bunch of us got in there in groups of 3. And I jumped with a pal of mine named Dave Eagles from the Royal Navy, and a Air Force guy named Mike Hawkins, who was also a pal. We were good friends. So we were a stick of 3, and we were leading the pack. And I was leading the lead. And I was first out of the airplane.
Did you hesitate?
Oh, not a second.
Wow, good for you.
No. So, and I'm standing there, and I'm looking down, and they were over the English Channel, about 5 or 6 miles offshore. And there's a good wind blowing. And down below, they have 3 RN launches, and each launch, as the 3 guys come out, each launch picks up one of them, because they really don't want to lose anybody.
No.
Because a lot of us are foreigners, and that would be complicated. Anyway, so the signal came. I stepped out, and I remember the jolt of the chute opening, which was surprising. Nobody had mentioned that. Whoop! And then the next thing I know, life is good. I'm hanging in the parachute. I'm coming down, I'm yelling at the other guys that bailed out behind me, and they're behind me and above me. There's a certain amount of, and we can talk. And I'm going down, and I can see there's waves and white caps. Well, anyway, I'll find out. And then it started going wrong when I didn't recognize I was about to enter the water. So I had not unlocked the quick release. The quick release was still firmly locked when I hit the water, and a microsecond later, the rest of me was in the water, still locked into harness. And the next thing that happened was the wind inflated the parachute, and I had a sailing lesson, except that I was underwater.
Oh no!
And so I recall being towed along at not a big clip, but a reasonable clip.
Yeah.
And the waves were big enough, and I was having a bit of a struggle to get to the quick release box, which I think I eventually unlocked it. And by this time, the rescue boat had arrived. I was still in the parachute. They had to catch up, but they fished me out.
Okay.
And got the parachute off me, and I vomited a bit of salt water. Oh, more than a bit maybe, but I was fine, except I was cold and unhappy, which they corrected with naval rum.
That'll work.
Yeah. And drove. And they got the other guys, and then they went out and got the next stick. And they weren't wasting any time. It was pick them up, drop them off, go back out, and get the next ones. And that was my adventure in parachuting.
Yep.
And
is that the only time?
I decided after that I wouldn't do this anymore for fun.
That's probably a wise choice.
And I'd had enough.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
Yeah.
Good experience. And
yeah.
The The Brits were the Brits.
Yep.
The training was minuscule, to say the least. And that's the way it is.
Yeah.
And I began to appreciate them and like them. You were treated like a sort of grown-up.
Yeah.
Very few flying rules. Their attitude was, if you are stupid enough to kill yourself in one of our airplanes, far better it'd be in one of our old clunkers than in something new later on. And we had accidents at Farnborough, especially in Canberra's, and doing asymmetric or engine and operative training or testing. And I guess on average they lost about a person a year, I guess.
Well, especially I would think back then being a test pilot with, again, as we discussed earlier, the rapid advancement in technology.
Yeah.
That'd be quite challenging. Like, I can't imagine it, really.
Well, yes.
Would have been exciting, I think, in many ways, too.
Yeah, well, a lot of the technology improvements were in the business of taking the pilot out of the cockpit.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, the captain was the captain. You've experienced that.
Yep.
And a lot of accidents happened because a lot of pilots made really bad decisions. Even experienced guys did stupid things.
Yep.
And a lot of this stupid thingery could be eliminated by taking the pilot away from the controls and having it automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a large part of the technological advances in the transport business. And I only stayed in the military business for 2 more years. I left the Air Force 2 years later and went and joined the National Research Council for a year, which was really interesting. But it was the National Research Council, as you may or may not know, is complete with tall foreheads.
Mm-hmm.
You know what that means?
No, please explain. I have an idea in my mind, but you tell me.
People with a middle of hair and a large amount of brain. And
so kind of like me, but with a larger brain, basically.
They had big brains, and while my brain is as good as any average guy's brain, I was in no class with those guys. And I quickly came to realize that if I had any notions of advancement, it was not going to be in the National Research Council, where degrees and publications are everything. And if you don't follow that path,
it was more science-based.
Research for the sake of research.
Wow. So let's just tie up your military career. So you finished at Farnborough.
Yeah.
You came back for 2 more years.
Yeah.
And I remember you mentioned before we got on camera, you talked about the F-86
Yeah.
6.
Yeah.
And how much you love that airplane.
It's the best, by far the best beautiful flying machine I have ever touched. Yes.
And it was a Canadair-built F-86, right?
Canadair
so it had more
F-86, and sadly, because it only had 50 caliber machine guns, it wasn't worth a toot in a war.
But it was a good flying machine.
It was a wonderful flying machine.
Wow. So you finally got to achieve your dream before you flew the CF-100 of flying an F-86.
I flew the F-86 after.
Yes.
Now, the CF-100, in contrast, was a war machine.
Yeah.
And for people of the persuasion where the guy says, "Show me the guns."
Yeah.
That's a familiar Air Force expression for some people who, when they see an airplane, all they want to know is, where are the guns?
Yep.
So, but on the F-86, if somebody shows you the guns, you'll be disappointed.
Yeah.
But the CF-100 had a boatload of rockets, and it was a serious weapon of war.
It
No
was
doubt
built to
about
fight,
it.
for sure.
Yeah.
So you flew the F-86. What else did you fly?
The 104.
104. How was that?
Well, that was very nice. I went out. I had to go out to Cold Lake to fly the 104, and I remember being, you can't help but be impressed. It goes really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Can't turn worth a shit, but you have guided weapons on it, guided rockets, so you don't need to turn fast. It's like the CF-100. You have to find the target, lock onto the target, fire the weapon.
Yeah.
Then the Canadian CF-100s in Europe were carrying tactical nuclear weapons. And they were doing this with a real fun maneuver called a lob, where they would fly on the deck, pull up, and at exactly the right time, the bomb would release and go, whee!
Yep.
They would come right over in their bags.
And this is in the CF-100 or the CF-104?
No, it's a 104.
A 104,
and
okay.
They would go like hell in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many of the Canadian public realized, I don't think they advertised a lot, that the RCAF was in Europe with nuclear weapons and ready to use them.
Yeah.
Just like that. Now, we didn't control the nuclear weapons, but the Americans did, and they were happy to have our help.
Mm-hmm.
Then, after the nukes were turned down, or for whatever reason, maybe government got cold feet, then they turned to photo reconnaissance, and they armed the airplanes with cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Boring.
Yeah.
But what a come down. So now they had the latest in camera technology, and I flew the cameras in a CF-100 out of Uplands, which is another story. But anyway, that was the come down again. They were like the Sabres with 50 caliber guns that couldn't do anything. They had this beautiful weapon of war which only had cameras.
Yeah.
Take my picture.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how people felt.
Yeah. I can understand that.
Aircraft are weapons of war, and to be effective, they have to have weapons of war.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they don't, they're useless, or pretty much.
So you finished up with the being a test pilot with the military.
Yep.
You get out of the military with 65, you said, right?
Yeah, 65, yeah.
Okay. And then you did a year at the NRC.
Yeah.
And then after that, I know you got into test piloting, but who were you working for?
After the NRC?
Yes.
Well, that was very interesting. I got, to answer the question, the Department of Transport, Canadian Department of Transport, I got recruited out of NRC.
Okay.
That was the most interesting job I have ever had.
Really?
Oh.
I mean, coming from a fighter pilot, that says a lot.
Well, I flew every kind of airplane all over, well, not all over the world, but Russia, Israel,
wow,
Europe, the USA. I flew Russian airplanes. My game was airworthiness. And the deal was, if a manufacturer wanted to have his airplane approved in Canada, it had to meet the airworthiness standards, which included design, flight testing, and all kinds of other things. I won't bore you because you don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
But my business was seeing that airplanes met the airworthiness flight test standards, which are complicated, thorough, complete, and if you're, for example, designing a new airplane, to get it certified, including the flight test certification, the flight test program usually takes up to 2 years and 3 or 4 airplanes. So you build an airplane which will conform to your design, let's say for wings and tails, how it works, which will, and that's another one set of tests for stability and strength and on and on and on, landing, takeoff. Another set of rules for power plants, which requires another airplane. Another set of rules for what we call systems, which in the modern age is probably the most complex and sophisticated.
Yep.
The airplane has to conform to the standards for all the systems, all the automatic systems, everything. And to demonstrate compliance with these airworthy standards is expensive and time-consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, they usually have a fourth airplane, which is used for what is called function and reliability. This airplane is used to get a lot of hours on the final configurations to see if any problems show up in simulated operational use. And so this airplane for a while may be used for engines, may be used for systems, may be used for the airframe and flight characteristics, and used for all of them together. But it's a busy airplane.
So they'll fly up to like a Callaway and do cold weather testing on it, or
cold weather testing, but basically systems.
Yep. So they all integrate.
Unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's just new airplanes. And then if people have want to modify older airplanes, they also have to show the modification meets the standards. And so this often, for instance, a turbo water has to do, now they're all long approved, certified.
But just to convert it from a piston otter into a turbo otter.
Into a turbo, and
Gotcha.
then and the DC-3s are some are converted to
Yep.
turboprops. The CL-215, which I flight tested, and I lived with the company for 2 years, and I flew with them side by side, but I was the airworthiness test pilot for DOT. And that occasionally got hairy. More than occasionally. But it was lovely because even though the CL-215 was not exactly a modern fast design,
No.
It's a water bomber for Christ's sake, but it was really interesting because it was a flying boat. It was a restricted category airplane. They couldn't carry passengers in it. We had, just to give you an example, it had to pass icing tests, and they did not want to put anti-icing boots or any anti-icing on the flying surfaces. And research had shown that it didn't need them.
No.
And so they had built shapes, which they glued onto the leading edge of the wings and on the tail. And these were twin-horned shapes. They went like this. They were huge. They were all along the leading edge of the wing. And we flew that airplane a lot to prove that with all this ice on board, or these shapes, they did not have any adverse effects on the aerodynamics.
So the purpose of the shapes is to simulate different times of icing and like
Yes.
rime icing, so that way it can dam on an airframe.
And then we went out in real ice,
Okay.
real heavy ice,
Okay.
and nothing happened. What I'm trying to give you an indication of is this job. Nobody thinks that working for the government is interesting, but we were a very small group. I wound up being the chief. Nobody could look over our shoulders. There was nobody who knew our business in the government.
You were kind of on your own.
We were on our own.
Now, were the other pilots all ex-military?
They were all they were all engineers.
Okay.
They were all either Empire Test Pilot School or United States Air Force Test Pilot School or U.S. Navy. There were 4 of them.
Okay.
And helicopters,
Mm-hmm.
or helicopter test pilot school. And it was really interesting. And you were on your own. You were your own flight safety department because there was nobody.
Mm-hmm.
And you made up your own flight test schedule, and you knew what the rules were and the standards, how to go about it. And occasionally it was hazardous. That's
I can
all
imagine,
I can
of
say.
course, yeah.
Things happened. And but it was great. I enjoyed going to work every day.
And that was all based in Ottawa?
We were based in Ottawa.
So you must have...
I loved it.
You must have been... Yeah, I love the Ottawa area. So,
Well, and I loved the job.
the job sounds amazing, too. So you would have been involved in the development of quite a few, I guess, Canadian airplanes. Of course, the CL-215 you mentioned, the Dash 8.
Yeah.
You mentioned that helicopter, the Avro helicopter, what was it called again?
Yeah, well, it was the Avian 2180.
Okay.
Those were the engineers who were fired when the CF-105 folded. And they had this bright idea of making a gyroplane.
Okay.
Because nobody had done that really successfully. There
Okay.
had been gyroplanes, and I flew. I think I'm the most experienced in many senses of the word gyroplane pilot in Canada, because I think I flew 4 different types.
Oh, wow.
McCullough, the Emba, or maybe it was 3. And the Avian was, I can't remember the third. Anyway. And they got financed by a guy in the States who had a lot of money who was interested. The guy who was responsible for the Franklin aircraft engine.
Okay.
Ever heard of that?
Yep, I have.
I've flown them on that Bell 47.
Hmm.
Anyway, he was interested, and so he financed it. Now, if this is being recorded, and it is, it would be impolite of me to talk frankly about the Avian, and I won't.
Okay.
But suffice to say, there were a few problems.
Okay. Duly
But it
noted.
did sort of get certified,
Sort of. Almost. Yeah. So, okay, that's great. Now, you mentioned you flew a couple Russian airplanes. Which Russian airplanes did you fly?
Yak 40.
Okay.
Yeah, the Russians wanted to sell the Yak 40 in Canada. It was a DC-3 replacement.
Okay.
It had 3 jet engines. It had a swept-back wing. It was an excellent airplane in many regards. It was easy to fly. It was slow. In landing and takeoff was kind of... The Russians would operate it off fields
Of course.
with high flotation tires.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wound up in Moscow with a crew of engineers for the airworthiness business, and a Yak 40, which they wanted us to explain to them the problems they would have to certify this thing.
And what year was this?
75.
So it's middle of the Cold War.
It was cold.
The Cold War was
Yeah.
still quite cold.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it was so, and where amusing things happened. I had the highest regard for the Russian technical capabilities. Their designers, until I went to Russia, I always thought they were kind of primitive.
Mm-hmm.
I know a bit about the T-34 tank,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a good design. It sure helped them win the war,
Oh, did it?
and the Russians are the ones who did the heavy lifting in winning the war. But God, it was rough. in manufacturing, welds and everything else. But it was a good design. I found out when I was involved in the Yak 40, they were superb engineers. And it is true that right after the war they were doing copies of mean engines, German flight tests and flight and tunnel works, high-speed tunnel. They copied everybody, but they left all that behind long ago. Excellent engineers, no question. Anyway, so I got the Yak 40, and I think I got 1 or 2 flights in, and then the ticklish subject of stalls came up. That we knew for a fact that the airplane had a deep stall from which there was no recovery. Lots of airplanes have that. The reason for this is the engines were at the back, and when you stall the airplane, the engine's blank, the tailplane ceases to function because it's in separated air off the engines, and you dive into the ground. Have a cookie.
Well, I just have to make a quick phone call.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
No
we'll
problem. We can
make
wrap
a
this
day
up.
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is going on forever. Jesus, 1:30.
Yeah, about an hour and 38
You
minutes.
guys would be dying of hunger.
No, that's all good. This is
But
great.
I'm not talking about the CF100 now. Anyway, so I proposed a flight test to do stalls, indicating I knew nothing about the Yak 40 stall. In fact, I do a lot about the Yak 40 stall, but I want to see what they would do. So here was this flight test program full of stalls of every sort and description. And they said, sure, that's fine, good. And I thought, oh.
You talked yourself into a corner now.
I think I feel a headache coming on. So we get in, we taxi out. And I've barely left the tarmac and the radio buzzes. Incidentally, the Russian pilot who was in the right-hand seat spoke no English. The flight engineer, whose name I won't mention for fear they execute him, he spoke a few words of English, but very few. Anyway, the radio, he talks in the radio and he looks at me and he says, I'm so sorry. We have to abort. There's too much traffic. There was not an airplane in the sky.
It's Russia.
But I knew. I said, okay, sure, we'll go back. And we go back, and it said tomorrow, and SAP says tomorrow. So tomorrow, we started out again. I got partway down the taxiway. The radio goes, SAP says, too much traffic. I think, twice in a row. How often are they going to use this? Forever?
Yeah.
I taxi back. We go out for the third time. And SAP says, we can keep going, but stalls are canceled. Well, that was the whole program. So I said, well, we might as well go back. And SAP says, yes. So I go back, and they say, I said, so stalls are canceled? Yes. No explanation. I don't need to ask. And that was the end of stalling on that for that year. Oh, I flew the airplane. Oh, God, the things that went on. I was out taking off one day with the Russian pilot, taxiing down, and up ahead are a gaggle of older women with wheelbarrows and brooms. And there's 4 or 5 of them, and they're on the taxiway. And there's a lot of noise, and they don't hear us coming. And this is professional flying at its best. Soviet pilot wipes my hands off the power levers, puts them to the wall. And we leap for after the engines spool up a bit. We leap forward, and there's no way we can stop. We're bearing down on these gals, and one of them turns around. I don't know how close we were. We were close. They dived off the edge of the taxiway, and there's wheelbarrows and brooms and black bloomers. They're flying down the side of the thing, and the Russian captain turns to me and he says, no, it was Sap. Sap turns to me and says, they shouldn't have been there. Pulls the power levers back. Incidentally, in the Russian system, the flight engineer does not hesitate at any time to operate the power without notice. So if you're coming in to land and he decides to pull all the power off and you don't agree, that's too bad.
It's his call.
He is responsible for the safety of the airplane in the Russian system.
Huh.
That is really unusual.
Yeah, it's a.
But in fact, he had a few brains. Anyway, enough of the Yak 40. I've talked to you guys out. I think there's no sense going on because it'll go on forever.
Well, it sounds like we almost need to do come do a round two and just talk about your test flying days. Sometime.
Well, yeah, I guess I don't know.
Oh, we could talk about that some other time.
Yeah, well, maybe my wife and I. Well, of course, she'd have to sit around.
We can entertain her, but
I don't know. Maybe if you guys want to come up again, which I would not suggest because you've screwed your whole day.
no, we don't mind at all. Well, we can just wrap this up, Richard. That was a fascinating story, and thank you for sharing with us. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure, and
Sounds like you've had quite the fascinating career.
well, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what can you say?
Well, that's great. Thank you
I'm
so
sure
much.
you have too.
I can't complain about mine.
No.